Hello there.
Morning.
Hey everybody.
Welcome to the next episode of Unifying Force. I'm Catherine, joined by Gio and Dave. How's everybody today?
Hey, doing really well.
So, as we spontaneously talked about on our previous episode, today we're going to talk about Orphans and Star Wars and why Lucasfilm is so obsessed with it, as much as it might drive some of us crazy. Gio, do you have any thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, so it seems to be a great way to begin a new story from the beginning with the original idea of Luke, the lonely farm boy looking out to the stars. It's a good way for a coming of age story to be told. It gives obvious and immediate adversity, and it's a way of beginning a story of adventure that has the tropes that are quite popular in literature and yet still give stakes to a story because effectively the main character is alone. And we see this again and again through each kind of new central protagonist in Star Wars.
Yeah, that's true. What do you think, Dave?
I don't think this is an obsession solely by Lucasfilm. I mean, if you look at stories at large, is my favorite, non-Star Wars orphan, brought to Earth from another planet. It's just, I think there was a post a while back in the Facebook group that asks, is there anyone in the Star Wars universe who was raised by their biological parents like into their teens? And some of the comments are this person or that person or the other person, but a lot of it is, having a happy normal childhood doesn't necessarily make for good storytelling. And there's it's got to have that some sort of problem, some sort of device that makes us interested and makes us want to watch, and this is it oftentimes.
Yeah, they do that for a lot of characters. With Luke, it kind of made sense because they ended up later on baking it into the backstory of that character, like him getting super excited to find out that his dad was a fighter in the Clone Wars and Jedi and all that. And then with the prequels, it made sense in the spirit of being, rhyming with the originals to do that again. But they at least gave him a mom, which was a nice change. Like, okay, so that's where that's going with it. But we haven't seen and they of course repeated again in the sequel trilogy with Rey to mixed results, and they've done it also a lot in the expanded universe, even to the point that it's almost a guarantee that a new protagonist, will probably be an orphan again. Sort of like what we had with Rogue One, even, and even the Han Solo movie. They never really explicitly said why Han was living like kind of like a street urchin, if you will. And the way he mentioned his father to Lando, oh, he used to work on Freighter's Ball. It's like, okay, it almost feels like you don't want to talk about him. You were just mentioning a talking point to connect with Lando. So it suggests that something may have happened there as well. So that's an interesting way that and whereas Leia, I mean, yes, she wasn't raised by her biological parents, but she was sort of raised by people who were arguably her parents through adolescence and into early adulthood.
Well, and then so was Luke as well into early adulthood. But I think you get the impression from all of the Star Wars stories that this is common in the galaxy. Han wasn't alone on he was with the whole crew of, what do they call them, scrum rats, Kira as well, and that whole crew of young orphans who are working for the crime lord. I just finished reading the Ahsoka novel, and Ahsoka, to blend in, this is after Order 66, and to blend into the new planet that she's come to, and she, her backstory is, oh, I'm an orphan, oh, my parents are gone, or I had these adopted parents. Presumably she's talking about Anakin and Obi-Wan, and they're gone as well, and nobody questions that. It's, oh, I'm an orphan, because she was in a group of a bunch of other orphans. Maybe intentionally is George and others who are doing this are showing what kind of unrest the galaxy is in by the number of orphans.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, figuratively speaking, all the Jedi younglings are a sense orphans because they leave their parents so young. And even though Padme had parents, they weren't living with her in the palace when she was said to be 14 in episode 1. But they did raise her. But that was another interesting aspect of it. And that gives me an idea for a whole other episode that we'll get to at another time. But yeah, orphans, it does create somewhat of an interesting jumping off point there. But I always thought that wouldn't it be the way that if they could use it also in a different way, kind of like with Anakin when he goes to seek out his mother again in episode 2, and the way that turns out ends up having like at that point he truly is orphaned, and you see where that takes him, similar to Jyn, or whereas you have the exact polar opposite response from Jyn Erso, where the parallel there, like with episode 2, it's Anakin holding his mother as she dies, and in Rogue One, it's Jyn Erso holding her father as he dies. But both those characters have two very strongly different reactions to that. It's like she decides to become a hero, Anakin ends up going down the path to become a villain, and it's like, okay, I've seen that where these parallels are going. And then Han, in a sense, being kind of like the street urchin, reminded me a bit of Luke in the first part of Star Wars, where, I mean, yeah, he's technically not completely an orphan because he was raised by an aunt and uncle, but he's like a gearhead, wants to go to Tashi Station, hang out with his friends, go flying T-16s in Beggar's Canyon, and screwing around and having fun. But then by the time we get to the sequel trilogy, you could argue that Finn is probably an orphan as well, because all the stormtroopers were kidnapped from their parents, and then Jannah was another one in episode 9. Which I loved that camaraderie that Finn and Jannah had, that they were able to bond over that, albeit it was very brief. And I think it was mentioned that Poe may have been one of the only characters raised by his parents into adolescence, but he wasn't really a main character, and we didn't really meet him when he was that young, so he's just kind of, already there. But
Yeah.
like even this character here, James Bond, that's another orphan. And so that kind of, you're right that it does seem to have an appeal, because it's like, let's create another obstacle for our characters, and usually at some point they're going to find out that their parents had something to do with the larger scheme of things. But it is interesting that your main characters and all your Jedi were essentially orphaned as well. And if there's something major to say about that, and wouldn't it be interesting if at some point they were all to come into, if you had a bunch of main characters enter the series who were not orphans and have them interact with the ones who were, and what type of dichotomy that would create if there was any other like interpersonal conflicts like arising from that. Like Palpatine, as we saw, would keep wrapping Anakin around his finger over the play on the fact that, oh, remember what you told me about your mother and the Sand People, and all these other little comments that he would just keep utilizing that as another weapon there. Or even in the sense that Jedi Masters are sort of like figuratively almost like parents to their apprentices, like Dooku being so convinced that Qui-Gon would have totally joined with me. And when you think about the timeline, it's like, yeah, the Jedi younglings get started paired with their masters when they're like 5 years old or something. And so that kind of makes sense that Dooku would think that. It's like, at first, of course, we're like Obi-Wan, oh, that can't possibly be true. But when you think about the fact that, yeah, it's almost like you're kind of an orphan, you've been placed into this other, household of great reverence, and so you're going to follow that person's direction. Whereas if you have somebody like, say, Kira, who's like completely orphaned, they're definitely gonna, walk their own path. And as we see through that film Solo, she's a lot more handy and competent than she may have initially seemed, which is really cool.
Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned Dooku there, and mentioned, Anakin and what happens when he's back with his actual parent, is because essentially Dooku's slide down the path to the dark side in the Dooku audio drama, or I don't know, audio
Jedi Lost.
play,
Yeah, audio drama, yeah.
It is his slide toward the dark side really begins when he goes back to his home planet and accidentally meets his family. It is the orphan and the one trained by the Jedi to not have attachment starts having these attachments. Is George, is the Jedi Order, are they setting Jedi up for the turn to the dark side in creating this kind of life.
Well, you can
Yeah,
make that. Yeah. Yeah, go for that. Good, Joe.
that's a really good point. I was gonna come to that. The Jedi younglings themselves, by being separated from that kind of familial bond early on, could be seen as George Lucas essentially saying this is one of the fundamental flaws of the Jedi Order in its establishment, because you're effectively ripping apart families. And so that sort of early security and emotional stability that might come from a biological family or a family unit is immediately removed. And so the Jedi as individuals are alone and have to perhaps learn resilience for themselves before they're even paired up with a master later. Because, of course, they are taken as foundlings, as younglings, for their sort of early years, until as they come into their teenage and adolescence, they are then paired up with a master. And perhaps that's a great foil, a contrast to Anakin, who he initially had that family connection. And did that lead him to make fundamentally different and more destructive choices later in life, in that he had something initially, an emotional connection, and it was then absolutely destroyed? He felt that he had some greater power into perhaps changing that. And that is fundamentally one of the reasons why he goes over to the dark side, as well as you mentioned, having those almost easy points for a master puppeteer like Palpatine to emotionally blackmail him and manipulate him into becoming an agent by his side and of his hand. With the non-force using characters like Jyn Erso and Han Solo, it's a great way of showing that the force alone isn't the only way to create a inner resourcefulness. And I really like the description of the young Luke, Han, and also Jyn. They seem to be very mechanically sound, very adaptable. They can pilot vehicles, drive ships, and they have their own inner ways of surviving, which perhaps wouldn't have been there if they had all the regular sort of family unit around them.
Yeah, and speaking of whether or not they're being set up to fail, Kylo Ren is a perfect example of that. Or should I say Ben Solo, because he wanted to stay with his parents, but was not allowed to. And unfortunately, the powers that be were not intelligent enough to realize that would have been a much better story to tell rather than skipping all of that. but you get the sense even in the very briefest of flashbacks and briefest of moments. Like my favorite scene in episode 9 is when you have Han Solo show up, because yes, it's replaying the dialogue of their conversation between episode 7, but since episode 8 and its flashbacks already happened, it like has a whole other layer of context to it, and you're getting that sense that that's like the epitome of what bad things can happen if you take kids away from their parents when they don't really want to go. And it's like, man, that'd be a really interesting story to tell. Which is why I still really want them to do like a mini series surrounding a Finn-like character, because I thought that was such a great idea. Because when you combine the orphan aspect of it, as well as because you think about it, the First Order's nature of taking kids and putting them in, brainwashing them into this whole cult, is like the evil but not so different version of what the Jedi are already doing for thousands of years in the prequel, up till the prequel era, and would be really great commentary. Imagine if you had like that type of classic old school Jedi who had been orphan paired against like a stormtrooper like that who'd been torn away. That could make for really interesting conflicts. Like what if you had the opposite effect? Like the Jedi torn away from their parents may have been going down the dark path, whereas the stormtrooper torn away their parents may go down the light path. And those are different ways you could play around with that, aspect of it.
Well, and I find the funny thing is the characters in Star Wars don't, obviously it's a plot point, okay, but they don't learn from this. Luke doesn't learn when he sets up his Jedi Academy to do the same thing. He's taking Ben at that, granted, not as early age from what we see. I think Wikipedia states that Ben Solo left for the Jedi Academy around age 10. So, he did have some sort of family time, we presume, which would be another cool story to see. But because of that unhealthiness of going away to the Jedi Academy and the things that happen with Luke, he's not an orphan. Actually, he does have those parents. He's kind of being raised like an orphan, but that inevitably leads him to actually make himself an orphan. Spoiler alert. When he takes out Han. Um, and that has to be part of his path apparently to go where he's going is that are you strong enough to do it? And um
Yeah. And then you have on the flip side characters like Hux who killed his father so he could move up the chain, and you could tell he clearly was not mature enough yet to make that decision because of the way his personality goes. And it's like that's somebody deliberately denying themselves a parent to move up, get ahead. And it's like, yeah, that's not really work out.
so in opposed to give credit where credit's due, to give this has inspired me, the post on the Facebook page by Chris Jeffers. There's been a lot of comments, and what they're saying is, yes, Poe had a normal childhood. Possibly Palpatine would have had a normal childhood, which is really kind of throwing the juxtapositions. Is he would have had a family life and grown. Leia did with Bail Organa. The Organas did to some extent. Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru may have had normal childhood, though at least we know that Shmi was killed by Tusken, or kidnapped at least by Tusken Raiders, so there's some in that. But one thing I find really interesting is in 2019, in a comic book, Darth Vader 25, is they kind of allude to that maybe Anakin wasn't force born, that the midichlorians were influenced by Palpatine to create him. And immediately after that comes out, is the writers and the artists on that are like, whoa, come out on social media backtracking that. Is why would that be so important? Is like, I in my head canon that was already there, but why would they go and backtrack that as soon as they put that out?
You have thoughts, Joe?
It's a fundamental piece of the story that and one of the central mysteries of Anakin's birth, and how the prophecy of the chosen one, which isn't ever really nailed down in any of the canon or non-canon material. I guess it's a lot of the mystique taken away from Anakin's origin, and what ideally makes him special from the beginning, in that there was no father, as Shmi tells Qui-Gon in episode 1. To say that the kind of overarching villain is the reason for the central protagonist, who starts out as a hero, then becomes an anti-hero, and through his journey decides to take on the guise, the mantle, and the side of the villain, perhaps undoes Anakin's heroship in essence, almost to say that his very being into existence is the manipulation of a villain, almost takes away from his goodness, his nobility initially, which is meant to, I guess, be the great adventure you go on through the prequels, which is articulated a lot more deeply and in maybe more nuanced ways through the Clone Wars series, that Anakin had many good qualities from the beginning, and through his experience and through his labors, he began to see a shorter, quicker way of doing things, which led him down a much darker pathway. So perhaps it's that de-heroizing of Anakin that maybe the story group weren't so keen on having out there. But I tended to see it as something that could be something that fans ourselves, we fill in these stories, we complete in our own head canon what the answers are to some of these mysteries. And that's some of the fun of it, to take away this sort of speculation of, oh, did Palpatine have an influence? Was it Plagueis who famously wanted to manipulate midichlorians to create life? The way I saw initially in The Revenge of the Sith, it was Palpatine speaking from a sense of total deception and manipulation to turn Anakin around to his side, rather than explicitly sort of saying, any kind of miracle in the Force could be as a result of him or his own master being the influences of it. And so perhaps the Force itself, in looking at the binary sort of balancing of things, and it's always a tricky kind of minefield to talk about the balance of the Force and what George Lucas meant. From interviews that he's done, it seemed that he saw the goodness or the light side as the default characteristic of the Force, and the dark side being a corruption of it. So maybe more in line with what George Lucas originally had in his vision of the Force, that the default state is of peace, and that is can be referred to as light or good. So perhaps it was a retaliation of the Force, a sort of natural correction of a sort of artificial imposition by the dark side, by Plagueis, by Palpatine, Sidious, where they were experimenting and tinkering to manipulate things for their own nefarious needs. The Force worked to counteract that, and perhaps offer a form of salvation for the natural order of things and for the Jedi through Anakin's birth. So it wasn't so much that, and where I really liked the idea of Palpatine having some influence, I do see it as kind of destabilizing the heroic mythology of Anakin a little bit. So that's where I am with the story group's influence and kind of backtracking, because it is quite a statement to say that Palpatine was directly influenced in the conception of Anakin, or the birth of Anakin.
Well, that, in a sense, that's a given, though, anyway, because that's why he's there in the first place. Because otherwise, he would just be a regular kid born of regular parents. Because either he created him, or the Force is retaliating against Palpatine's machinations. But in any case, I believe in that comic. I haven't read it yet, but I heard that it was like the writers came out to suggest that no, it's not that we're saying that's specifically what it is, but that's like a vision that Vader's having or something. Mm-hmm. Like it's like something that he's like something that Vader's contemplating that he doesn't necessarily, he suspects and doesn't really know is true or whatever. And people took it to mean that that's what it was. But given the current state of Lucasfilm, I wouldn't be surprised if it was just them backtracking because of the backlash to it, rather than, because they're not really ones to commit these days. But I think that could have something more to do with it. Which is, and another orphan, of course, that we're going to see a lot more of soon is, of course, Boba Fett, who lived with an unconventional life, if you will, with Jango, no mother there, but in Clone Wars, when he goes to meet some of his connection, Jango's friends, they all seem to be very familiar with Boba and being very friendly. And it's almost like they had some quasi-dysfunctional family unit there. But you totally get in that shot in episode 2 where he's holding the helmet that, oh yeah, you can see where this guy's going to go. So it's not a surprise when you see that he does become a ruthless bounty hunter. But he also seems to, despite his journey and his, rough life, if you will, he still maintains a lot of the so-called moral code that his father had, which he touted quite a lot in The Mandalorian, and apparently will continue to do so in the Book of Boba Fett, which is interesting to go from somebody who it seems so cut and dry looking at just the movies alone that, oh yeah, I could see with his backstory in episode 2, witnessing his father's murder like that he would go on to be this kind of cold, impersonal bounty hunter. But to see that the goodness within him is kind of rearing its head again in Mandalorian is really interesting, that he still managed to cling to some of that.
Well, yeah, and I think his sense of family is very pronounced, because as he, reappears and reclaims the armor in The Mandalorian, is that he's very proud to show off the chain code in there. Is, this is my armor as it was my father's armor. This is who I am. I think that's very important. And I think you're right, is he really kind of did have a family with the Kaminoans. I think it's really interesting that this is an unaltered clone, and the age we see him in episode 2 is he's what, 8 or 10 years old?
Mm.
That,
Probably around 10.
they've
Yeah.
chosen to stay. Django and Boba have chosen to stay on Camino this long, and they're living there and having the Kaminoan scientists kind of, be a part of their family and all the clones. I think presumably Django was somewhat involved in the early training of them, but other than that, why are they still there?
I would assume that it's because, every once in a while you need more DNA samples. It's not like it gives one blood sample and then that's it. I would imagine that he's there for that. And given where Camino is, outside the Rishi Maze, the planet's been deleted from the archives. It's like, and because you have a massive army there to protect you, it's like a pretty good hideout, pretty nice digs for them anyway. It's like they don't have to worry about, other hiding out in other hives of scum and villainy where you're going to have, competition and problems. Like the Kaminoans obviously respect them a lot because they're their benefactors in that particular case. So that could be a reason why they're hanging out there, though I don't think they probably would have stayed there. If Django had lived, I don't think he would have continued to stay there during, the conflict that followed. Probably would have taken off. But that leads, yeah.
It's an interesting story point. I mean, would Django, had he survived, what role would he have played in the conflict on Mandalore, with the influence of the Black Sun and Darth Maul, or Maul at that point with Savage? It's quite an interesting story there that I guess wasn't told, but could be a big part of the book of Boba Fett. I mean, what happened in the interim period between the young Boba that we saw as a naive and impetuous kid in the Clone Wars to becoming a fearless and renowned bounty hunter, very much in line with his father.
Yeah, it's that would be interesting if Django still has his backstory from the expanded universe. Then I could totally see him trying to take advantage of that conflict to go take back Mandalore. But if he doesn't, and he's just this rogue bounty hunter who's just playing both sides for money and doesn't really care, then I don't think he would get near that conflict. But other characters who would play into that, of course, are Din Djarin. We see how his whole backstory is an orphan and being reared in yet another cult like the First Order or like the Jedi. And seeing how that, the whole first 2 seasons of the show have basically been about him being deprogrammed from that whole lifestyle, if you will, and now being presented with a really interesting choice because it's like, okay, we don't really know much about his parents. I don't think, do we know for certain what planet he was even from?
Not that I know of.
Yeah, so we don't really know about his family's culture. We don't really know if perhaps going forward in season 3, now that he's shed this whole Children of the Watch persona, he might be bringing things up to the surface from how he grew up, maybe go back and revisit his hometown, who knows? And we'll see how that definitely plays out, because now that he's being asked, we've seen him take on the parenting type role with Grogu, which is interesting dynamic to see, because he had been an orphan himself and now he's taking care of this kid, and now he's got this sword, and it's like, am I going to take care of all these people, or am I going to rise up for that? So that's other kind of interesting notion on it too. It's like I said, it's like, oh, the First Order, the children of the children of the Watch, and then you have the Death Watch has probably their own version of it, and the Jedi. It's like everybody, it's kind of all following, like all their ducks are in a row, if you will.
Well, and it's obviously from the talk of the armor between Din and the armor. This is not an uncommon thing. It's not like Din is the only orphan to be adopted by the Watch. Foundling is clearly a term in their society. This happens all the time. I think anytime we get a spotlighted new character, when we get Din, when we get Grogu, I think it's arguably when we get Broom Boy, who we thought was gonna a whole lot more happen with. What about Rose and her sister? Were there parents? I don't know that there were parents. And like you said, Finn and so many more characters, to where even Poe, though we know had this childhood growing up through additional material and stories and things that happen after the movie, do we hear about these things in the movies? In
Uh,
the, what most people see?
Nah, but he wasn't a character who was ever supposed to be in that trilogy anyway. So I could see why they didn't spend that much time expounding on him. But if they had, and if he had been originally written to be one of the big three, I think we would have heard a lot more about him.
Hmm.
Perhaps, or maybe not, because then again, we didn't really learn much about Han in the original trilogy either, as far as who, where he came from. But
Yeah,
yeah, that's why I'm wondering if going forward, because we see how doing the same orphan thing over and over again can get a bit into muddy water, because in the sequel trilogy, the fans it gets so predictable to the point where the fans built up all these expectations for the Rey character, and then when they decided to do something different with it, that would be kind of a new spin on it. It upset so many people, or angry minority, to the point that her journey in episode 9 was just completely destroyed and retrograded. And so it's like, maybe we can move on from Orphans now and see what's going on with those other people. Because what would it be like maybe to see somebody who was not an orphan, who was just had their parents there, but maybe more evil instead of good, like Poe being like almost the perfect vanilla person, and have like the opposite of that in a way. Because the expanded universe does that a lot with their characters as well, in terms of the old storylines and stuff,
Well,
all the orphans.
but will it happen? Because again, let's expand it beyond the Star Wars universe. Beyond is, DC does the same thing with Superman, and arguably the biggest of all time, Batman, because of how he was made an orphan, has made Bruce Wayne into Batman. It's kind of like the
Harry
trope.
Potter, another one.
Harry Potter is
Yeah, the
where
most popular character in fiction of this
where
century,
people
essentially.
where people would say, if just from watching the movies or early TV shows, I thought quicksand was going to be much more of a problem in life, you know, but it's not. Like, looking at some actual statistics, let's talk real numbers now. UNICEF says there are an estimated 153 million children worldwide that are orphaned, missing either one or both parents. And some other sources figure that, and I haven't done the math, to roughly about 6% of the population. And this is a lot of popular culture and things talking about this, you know, uh, talking about these sort of things and these stories for a 6% of the population. And even somewhat, though, if you look at true to life stories that they're told about an orphan, what about the Braveheart, William Wallace? This is a real character. This is a real presumable orphan, although there were a lot of liberties taken with that story, so don't hold me to it.
Yeah, he's not exactly the nicest guy.
Yeah, he's not exactly the guy that you get in the movie, but presumably at least some of that backstory might have been the story of the real William Wallace.
Well, you do get a lot of characters like that also in mythology, like Moses, or in a way Jesus, and others like that, and the whole, or even if they're not like a literal orphan, those who sort of deviate from whatever their parents are teaching them to find their own enlightenment, if you will. And you see that a lot, and like as was the case of the story of Siddhartha Gautama, it's kind of in a sense, but that was more of a true story, which then became adapted into the religion, which was really neat. And then the closest I could think of in terms of what the Jedi Order was doing was sort of like the Tibetan monks, where I can't remember how the selection process works, but certain kids are born and they're already determined that they are going to be raised in the monastery to become the next monks, and they like leave their parents, but it's not like a sad thing, because it's like a revered, oh wow, you've chosen us, so to speak,
Yeah, because is that because I think they were determined, kind of like that they have the force within them, that those children were deemed to be reincarnations of previous lamas, or
Yeah, that was my understanding of it too. That there was a pre part to their journey before this life that effectively made them the chosen to be part of a specific order. Yeah.
So I mean, and we know how George loves the mythology. We've talked about that repeatedly, and so you know, are these stories going to go away?
Well, I
I
mean, I think it's time that they should maybe start exploring a different avenue because they've done it so many times that it's almost getting predictable at this point. I mean, I know that originally is taken from the template of the whole hero's journey, uh, not in the sense that they're necessarily literal orphans, but they're kind of getting their feet wet, if you will, going out into the world and taking off and doing like an American Graffiti when Steve says, you can't stay 17 forever, you know, and taking off into the world in that way. So it'd be interesting to see who the next big Star Wars protagonist is going to be and what journey they're going to have. Or if you did have, since they play up with orphans so much, wouldn't it be interesting if they had two major characters, one being an orphan and one not, and actually utilizing that, like, into to make some interesting type of story there, as like, or at least as a jumping off point for inspiration. Because, like you said, it is very popular in a lot of fiction to do that, but or to have them be orphans. But I just thought it'd be kind of surprising to see a different avenue for a change, perhaps.
Yeah, if they were to develop, I mean, if a character like Poe Dameron had been a little more intentional and further developed, that would have been a good counterpoint to Finn being essentially found, adopted, and raised as a born soldier. The difference between what would happen given the same choices, the same sort of adventurous moments, where a character is presented with something that will be defining for their own life, as well as perhaps of greater consequence for those around them. Would they behave similarly, or would they behave the complete opposite to somebody who didn't have that family unit, or maybe something in between? And those kind of gray areas, I guess, are where some of the more organic stories that would be more perhaps similar to real life and to what even more people go through. That it's not necessarily cut and dried, that the character is the chosen one, born, has no mother, no father, biologically speaking, and then discovers these huge moments, essential plot twists beyond. I mean, it's not really going to be done in a more dramatic or memorable fashion than with Luke Skywalker and Anakin. So there is definitely room to explore that in between stage and then contrast it with the famous heroic and villainous orphans that we know of.
So do we have any questions in the chat about this?
I have not seen any questions. I've been monitoring and looking, have not seen a whole lot of questions about it. So let me ask a question then so you're saying who the next one is, the next that we're going to get in Star Wars. So presumably we know Obi-Wan's backstory. We know a lot of Ahsoka's backstory. Presumably we're going to get Andor. So what are they going to do with Andor? All I've heard of Andor's of Cassian's backstory is I've been in this fight since I was 6 years old. Was he orphaned at 6 years old and joined the rebellion?
Sure, because they got 12 episodes there, so there's going to be some big character arc for him, most certainly.
Yeah, although at that age, it does sound like it might be going down the tried and tested route that we know of.
Yeah, and then beyond that, I mean, way pre-production is we're looking at the Acolyte.
Maybe, yeah, that'd be fun to see that different spin on that. Should it get that far?
Should it get that far? That is correct.
Let's hope. It is more interesting to have these stories that are genuinely expanding the universe, to take that title from what was before Disney took ownership. That there's a lot more color and variety in the story that can be told if you're beyond the bounds of just the main feature films and the main saga. Lots of little characters, peripheral characters that were introduced in the Clone Wars. I mean, there are so many, and it's not just within the clones themselves. We've seen with the Bad Batch, that's a whole additional section of storytelling, and how the question of identity could come about even from characters and raised to be one and the same, to have just a single purpose and nothing else. You could even argue that Luke was raised just to be a simple farm boy, had one purpose, to just continue the family tradition as a moisture farmer, and yet he had these other interests, such as with the T-16s and picking up power converters, hanging out with friends, and then also looking beyond the horizon to widen his scope. But I guess it's a trope, a cliche, but it's continuously brought back throughout traditions in the real world. You can go back to classical antiquity and see characters such as Odysseus, Oedipus. There's always a central conflict that comes about either because the character is essentially alone and then can go on a great and grand adventure, or the parent comes into direct antagonism with the child later in life. But even in down to, I guess, Elizabethan times, Shakespeare loved the idea of an individual character who has to battle not only the adversity he faces physically, but also mentally in terms of loneliness and not having an understanding with his surroundings. It's the kind of key idea behind Hamlet and those tragic heroes that you could argue that George Lucas used that kind of thinking behind the setup we had for Anakin Skywalker.
So, do we have any idea where it's come from? Any idea?
That's a good question, because and again, in the case of mythology, they always say that there's a little grain of truth in there somewhere. But that is a fascinating question, because you do see it pop up in so many different mythologies and religions and histories and cultures, and it's like, why is there this obsession with this? Not exactly sure.
Yeah, I don't know that that's an answerable question.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But that would just be what I wonder, and it has been around. We're talking about these ancient mythologies that are the beginnings of history itself, and that's where this storyline has come from. I don't know.
Yeah. Or, like, I guess someone could argue that Indiana Jones, in a figurative way, is also that, because he didn't have his mom around very long and didn't have a good relationship with his dad. But then again, that's more of a cardboard cutout, in the sense that the movies don't really give you that much of a deep dive, because they're trying to, kind of like with the clone troopers. It's like, we get that technically they're orphans, but they don't seem to dwell on that or even have that notion of thought, because they're already made soldiers right out of the testing tube, if you will.
Well, we are getting more of that coming with the Bad Batch, and we got a lot of that with, especially towards the end of season 7 of the Clone Wars, to where they're starting to develop their own personalities, and they're developing their own families. Rex,
right, like in season 2, when what's his name had run away and started a family.
Mm-hmm.
And you could tell that as a father, he's using more of his military training in a way to be a parent, as opposed to something more, something a little bit different, because that's how he was, brought up.
Yeah, is you're seeing more and more of the clones that are doing that are breaking away, and in kind of the same way that you get the beginnings of that with Finn, with the beginnings of that with you've said her name and I can't think of it. Jannah.
Yeah.
You're starting to get those things. So maybe Star Wars is moving away. Maybe we'll see some more. I don't know.
Like, for example, when it comes to doing things different with it, I like, kind of like with the Omega character, for instance, she's not bothered by the fact that she doesn't have any traditional parents. She's kind of used to living in almost this sort of dysfunctional, this sort of group type family structure, and I like that, because it sets up a different path or a different type of storyline in which you're not going to have the same beats. Like, of course, if you're an orphan and your parents either still out there somewhere, like as was the case with Luke Skywalker, or with Anakin coming back to find his mother, then it's like it gives it at the point, like I said, it becomes a little bit predictable, which is why I like that with Omega. It's like, yes, you could still have your orphan trope, but they're not really acknowledging it. They're doing a whole new twist on it. And it's like
Yeah.
sending, which could set up a new, because I can't really predict off the top of my head, for instance, where Omega's going to go on her journey, as opposed to like when you see what happened with Luke or with Rey or with Anakin. Yeah, it's a little bit more cut and dry. You can kind of predict that a little bit easier than say characters like Omega or the individual clones.
Well, and to that end, I don't know that I see where Grogu's story is going.
That's true. And he's really interesting one, because it's like, okay, he's got there to the Jedi Temple is like the way all the other Jedi did, but he's a 50-year-old infant basically.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, that's going to be like, how much of his experiences in these is he going to even remember? Because it feels like he's still barely 2 years old, at least mentally, how much is that going to carry over?
Right, but you get the sense that there's more to it than we get in our story because of what Ahsoka was able to, talk with him, commune with him through the Force. Is that there's more going on? Is he does know some things? He knows his name. He knows that he was in the temple and those sort of things. So,
and he knew how to reach out to Luke.
Yeah,
at the temple, at that interesting temple.
Yeah,
he was able.
taken some trainings in the meditations.
I do wonder, though, in regards to pushing these more orphan tropes, if we'll learn more about Fennec Shan's backstory in the Book of Boba Fett, to add more dimension there and more relatability between Fett and Shan, because I'm not really sure if their partnership is one of simply because of mutual benefit, or did they know each other simply by reputation, or did they actually closely know each other before he found her out in the desert? That'd be kind of a neat thing to explore and try flipping that on its head, like he's the orphan, maybe she's not. See,
Is very well may. But the news is, the good news is, there's more content coming. There's more things coming. There's plenty of opportunity for this to be explored in many ways coming. We'll just have to wait around and see what Favreau and Filoni come up with.
mm-hmm.
And if we ever do get another trilogy, what is that going to be based upon?
How about let's not base it upon anything? Let's do something like really wild and try something original and out of the box.
Yes, I'm myself. A lot of people are saying now that we have all this great new material with the High Republic, and let's go there with the movies. And I'm like, we have this great material with the High Republic. Why don't we leave it there? Let's leave that as novels and comics and that tied in story. And yes, if we get a new trilogy, go somewhere else. Show us the old Republic. There's EU stuff on that, but show us.
It'd be a really interesting story to tell now that they've teased it. The founding of Exegol.
Mm-hmm.
And like how that whole story about the downfall of the Sith and the Sith at the hands of the Jedi, and Darth Bane starting his rule of two, which would be elements that would make another. I mean, I don't think they'll ever do a straight up adaptation of that trilogy, because so many people who are diehard fans have already read it and know it. And Lucasfilm does have some type of policy, or at least under the George Lucas days, that they're not going to literally adapt like page by page of any material they've already put out there. But that would be something, especially with Exegol, because it's like the idea that all of the Sith here are reared as children. So it's like, unlike the stormtroopers of the First Order, which need repeat conditioning, or the stormtroopers of the Empire who just grew up believing the Empire were heroic. In the case of Exegol, they don't have any exposure to anything else other than what is on that planet and what they're being shown, which makes them, in a sense, the perfect fighting soldier, if you will, because it's not something you have to keep conditioning. It's not something you have to worry about outside influence, because they're just going to be stuck in this little bubble. And that would be something else that'd be fascinating to see, because imagine how that would play in terms of an orphan dichotomy. Like if they met somebody like a Jedi, and the Jedi are like, well, yeah, we left our parents, we don't really miss it, and we had a great life and all of that. But then you meet these, it's like, how do you reason with these people, you know? Because if that's their only view of the world, that could make for good conflict and great storytelling as well.
Yeah, we almost had a little bit of that with the Night Sisters, looking at another planet and another society that was based upon a particular understanding and philosophy that was using the Force, but in a different way. Again, Maul is a great example of another orphan, but this time on the side of the dark, and how his struggles were very much almost a parallel to Anakin's, in that he went from having his identity fully formed as early as an apprentice to one of the great Dark Lords of the Sith, and yet he found himself tossed aside in a similar way to how Anakin effectively was, one could argue, tossed aside by the Jedi once he went over and made that fateful choice. I mean, of course, he'd committed a whole list of heinous acts, and he was becoming a genocidal egomaniac. But the very simple idea of one going from dark to light and light to dark over a particular either choice or incident is another way of highlighting how, I guess, stories can be told away from just the idea of the instant adversity being not having the standard parent, or missing one parent, or if not both. And yeah, I can see how your idea of Exegol being this entire almost siloed off world from the galaxy, and what kind of character development you could have just from these individuals grown en masse, almost in a similar way to the Kaminoan clones, but very much fixed with an idea of gaining more, gaining power, and taking over the galaxy, rather than just for a single kind of military objective, as we saw with the clones.
Yeah, and that's it, into more of, our previous discussions on cults in Star Wars is right there. Is, you've got your cult of the Sith on Exegol.
Yeah. Sort of like you were mentioning about the Night Sisters, that's another interesting thing that they could a whole other type of society. And maybe it would be interesting if they took a character like Asajj Ventress and made them more of a central character, because her story unfortunately never got finished. It just kind of, I mean, yeah, in the books, but it's so broken up that it's like, okay, some of it's in the books, some of it's in comics, and then some of it's on TV and the Clone Wars. It's like it's kind of broken up all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I thought they should have finished that story in season 7 instead of the Martez sisters, who admittedly are other orphans as well. That to me didn't really go anywhere. But yeah. So, any final thoughts, or any questions at all? Probably not.
No questions in the chat is I've asked and seen, but what I would say is, if there, other things that you're interested in, but that we've just touched on, like we said, if you're talking about cults, if you're interested in Star Wars, if you're talking about the Night Sisters and the Witches of Dathomir, these are other episodes of the Unifying Force where we've gone into more detail on that. If you're watching this, not live, and you have some further questions, hey, put them in the chat. We see that eventually. And we do monitor that, and it's all things that we could use for future topics, or we'll be happy just to answer your questions, possibly chat back at you that way.
All right, so yeah, a few plugs. Virtual Cantina is every happy hour every Tuesdays at 4 p.m. Pacific. We have a lot of fun with the after hours, especially Thursday night watch-alongs. We still do those. Upcoming this Thursday, we'll be doing Return of the Jedi with special guest Kevin Thompson. And if you've listened to one of his commentaries for these films before, they are very entertaining. So come and join us for that. And this Wednesday, we have another episode of the Speaker Series, highly anticipated. Paul Hirsch, one of the editors of Star Wars and the sole editor of Empire Strikes Back. That is going to be amazing.
And we are
And
preempting the regular Tuesday night this week as another episode of the Speaker Series. So we've got a Tuesday and a Wednesday episode of the Speaker Series this week. Tuesday is the name escapes me because my thing is fuzzed out here. But I think it was director of fan relations for Lucasfilm,
Miller?
That's right.
the OT, and that's going to be Tuesday night. So those are going to be at a different time. Those are going to be at 10 p.m. Eastern. What's that? 7 Pacific?
Yeah.
And I have no idea what time that is for you, Gio.
It's very late.
It's very
3
late.
a.m. I think.
But those are all archived, and those will be available on our YouTube channel to see after the fact if you're not up like Gio will probably be at 3 a.m. and just
It's becoming increasingly hard, but yeah, definitely worth checking out after the fact in the YouTube Star Wars page that we have, and there's a whole list of the previous ones to catch up on as well.
All right. So this has been the Unifying Force. Thanks for joining us. And we will return on Sunday, December 12th. Topic to be determined.
Topic TBA. That is what it says right here on the calendar. So we will see you again then. And until then, may the Force be with you.
Thank you. May the Force be with you all.
May the Force be with you all.